She stood in the center of the Ashworth ballroom while 100 eyes watched her humiliation unfold, and not a single soul moved to help her. The wineglass had slipped from Lady Pemberton's hand with theatrical precision, splashing crimson across the pale silk of Elara's gown. The stain spread like a wound, and the gasps that followed were not of sympathy but of quiet, delighted scandal. Elara could hear the whispers already, threading through the candle-lit air like serpents. Poor thing, 3 years married and still she cannot command his attention. He did not even escort her tonight. She arrived alone. I heard he has not spoken to her in a fortnight. Elara did not look down at her ruined gown. She did not flinch, did not weep, did not give them the satisfaction they so desperately craved. Instead, she lifted her chin and smiled at Lady Pemberton with such gentle grace that the older woman actually took a step backward. "How clumsy of me," Lady Pemberton murmured, though her eyes glittered with malice. "Do forgive me, your grace." "There is nothing to forgive," Elara said softly. "Wine washes out, character does not." The room fell silent. And then from the grand entrance behind her came the sound of slow footsteps, measured, confident, familiar. Elara did not turn. She knew those footsteps better than she knew her own heartbeat. For 3 years she had listened for them in every corridor, every drawing room, every empty bedchamber, waiting, hopping. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, walked past his wife without stopping. He did not look at her ruined gown. He did not acknowledge the crowd's discomfort. He simply moved through the ballroom like a ship cutting through fog, his dark coat immaculate, his expression carved from winter stone. He had not seen her. Or worse, he had seen her, and it had cost him nothing to look away. Elara's smile never wavered. She had practiced it too long for it to fail her now. But something deep inside her chest, something that had been fraying for months, finally began to tear. She had loved him since the day she first saw him at her father's country estate, when she was 17 and foolish, and believed that gentle hearts won gentle husbands. He had come to negotiate a trade agreement with her father, a minor baron with major connections. Alexander had been 28 then, already a duke, already a legend, already a man the world could not touch. She had watched him from behind a curtain, too shy to approach. He had smiled exactly once at something her father said, and that smile had shattered her. When her father told her 6 months later that the Duke of Ashworth had offered for her hand, she had wept with joy. She had not known then that the offer was not born of affection. It was a settlement of debt. Her father owed the Duke money, a great deal of money, and Elara was the payment, a bride to settle the balance, a transaction signed in silk and promises. Alexander had married her in the estate chapel on a gray November morning. He had spoken his vows clearly, without hesitation, and then he had looked at her with eyes that held nothing. No warmth, no cruelty, just absence. That was the day Elara learned that the opposite of love was not hatred. It was indifference. And for 3 years she had tried to bridge that distance with every tool she possessed. She learned his favorite foods and had them prepared for his solitary dinners. She memorized the names of his tenants, his business partners, his political allies. She wore the colors he preferred, read the books he admired, spoke only when she thought her words might please him. She made herself small, agreeable, invisible. And still he did not see her. The morning after the ball, Elara rose before dawn. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with falling wineglasses and averted eyes, but she did not allow herself the luxury of lingering in bed. There was work to be done. Since her arrival at Ashworth Hall, she had taken on the management of the household accounts. It had started as a desperate attempt to prove her usefulness. Surely a duke would value a wife who could balance his ledgers. But it had grown into something else entirely. She was good at it. The numbers made sense to her in ways that people never had. By the time the sun rose over the eastern gardens, Elara was already at her desk in the morning room, a cup of cold tea beside her, 3 ledgers spread open before her ink-stained fingers. She worked steadily, reviewing the estate's expenditures, noting discrepancies, drafting letters to merchants and tenants. She did not hear the door open. "You are awake early." Elara's head lifted sharply. Alexander stood in the doorway, still wearing his dressing gown, his dark hair slightly disheveled from sleep. He looked surprised to see her, as though he had forgotten she lived in his house at all. "I often am," she said quietly. He frowned as though this information troubled him. "I did not know." "No," she said, "you would not." The words were not meant to wound. They were simply true, and perhaps that was why Alexander's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been discomfort. "I came to inform you that Lord and Lady Wexford will be joining us for dinner tomorrow evening," he said, recovering his composure. "Wexford and I have business to discuss. You will arrange the meal." It was not a request. It was never a request. "Of course," Elara said. He nodded once, turned, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Elara sat motionless, her quill suspended above the ledger. Something inside her was shifting. A small, quiet, dangerous thought was taking root in the soil of her exhaustion. "I cannot do this anymore." She did not mean leaving. She could not leave. She had nowhere to go, no family to return to, no fortune to claim. Her father had died 2 years ago, penniless and unremarked. The marriage contract bound her to Ashworth permanently. No, what she meant was something else entirely. She could not keep loving him. It was killing her, this endless offering of a heart he did not want. This constant hopping, waiting, breaking. She must learn to stop. The dinner with the Wexfords arrived with all the grace of a funeral procession. Lord Wexford was a heavy-set man with a booming laugh and a habit of speaking over his wife. Lady Wexford was thin and sharp, her eyes constantly moving, cataloging every detail of the Ashworth estate with obvious envy. Elara had dressed carefully in a gown of dove gray, simple and elegant. She had instructed the cook to prepare Alexander's preferred menu. She had arranged the seating, the lighting, the wine selection. Everything was perfect. Alexander did not notice. He spent the entire meal discussing shipping routes and wool tariffs with Lord Wexford, his attention fixed on the man across from him as though no one else existed. Lady Wexford attempted to draw Elara into conversation several times, but the questions were barbed. "How do you occupy your days, Your Grace? I imagine the Duchess's life must be terribly idle." Elara set down her spoon. "I manage the household accounts, my lady. I also oversee the tenant correspondence and the estate's charitable distributions." Lady Wexford's eyebrows rose. "How industrious! And does His Grace appreciate your efforts?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Elara glanced at her husband. He was laughing at something Lord Wexford had said, his profile turned away from her, utterly unaware. "I do not do it for his appreciation," Elara said quietly. "I do it because it needs to be done." Lady Wexford's expression flickered with something that might have been pity, and that was somehow worse than the malice. After dinner, as the Wexfords were preparing to depart, Lord Wexford clasped Alexander's shoulder with boisterous familiarity. "Ashworth, you fortunate devil, a beautiful estate, a profitable enterprise, and a wife who asks nothing of you. What more could a man desire?" Alexander's smile was polite but empty, indeed. Elara stood 3 feet away, close enough to hear every word. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her cold bed, staring at the canopy above her, and counted the years stretching before her. 3 had already passed. How many more? 10, 20, 50. She imagined herself old, gray, still walking these halls in silence, still managing accounts that no one thanked her for, still loving a man who had never once looked at her with warmth. Somewhere around dawn, she made a decision. She would not leave Ashworth. but she would leave the space beside Alexander that she had been haunting for 3 years. She would build a life of her own within these walls, a quiet life, a useful life, but a life that did not depend on his affection. She would stop waiting, and if he never noticed her absence, then at least she would have her answer. The change began subtly. Elara still rose early, still managed the accounts, still oversaw the household with quiet efficiency. But she no longer arranged her schedule around Alexander's. She no longer lingered in doorways hoping he might speak to her. She no longer wore the colors he preferred. Instead, she began riding each morning before breakfast, exploring the estate's grounds with a freedom she had never allowed herself. She visited the tenants, learning their names and their struggles, bringing baskets of food and medicine to those in need. She spent hours in the estate library, reading books she had never dared to touch before, books about philosophy, astronomy, languages. She began learning Italian from an elderly tutor in the village, a retired scholar who was delighted by her dedication. She practiced in the garden, speaking the rolling syllables to the roses and the hedgerows. Weeks passed, then months. Alexander noticed nothing. Or so she believed. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, when the leaves had turned gold and the air carried the bite of approaching winter. Elara had just returned from the village, her arms full of books and her cheeks flushed from the cold, when she encountered a stranger in the entrance hall. He was tall, perhaps 30 years of age, with warm brown eyes and a smile that crinkled the corners of his face. He wore a traveling coat of excellent quality, and he was examining the portrait above the fireplace with obvious curiosity. "Forgive me," he said, turning as she entered. "I was told to wait here. I am Nicholas Harrington, Lord Harrington of Thornwood. I have business with His Grace." Elara curtsied smoothly. "Welcome to Ashworth Hall, my lord. I am the Duchess." Lord Harrington's eyes widened slightly, as though he had not expected the Duchess to be carrying her own books or arriving unaccompanied from the village. But he recovered quickly, bowing with genuine warmth. "A pleasure, Your Grace. I must say your reputation precedes you." Elara tilted her head. "My reputation. I have heard from several sources that the tenants of Ashworth have never been so well cared for. My own steward mentioned it just last month. Apparently your methods of crop rotation have been studied by neighboring estates." Something warm flickered in Elara's chest. She had not known anyone outside Ashworth was aware of her work. "You are kind to say so," she said, "but I merely do what seems sensible." "Sensible and rare are often the same thing," Lord Harrington replied, and his smile deepened. They spoke for several minutes about tenant farming and bookkeeping and the challenges of estate management. Lord Harrington listened to her with an attention that felt almost startling. He asked questions. He laughed at her observations. He looked at her as though she were the only person in the room. Elara had almost forgotten what that felt like. She was laughing at something he had said when she felt it, a presence behind her, heavy and still. She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway of his study, his expression unreadable. His gaze moved from Elara to Lord Harrington and back again, and something flickered in the depths of his eyes. Something dark. Something she had never seen before. "Harrington," he said, his voice perfectly level, "you are early." Lord Harrington bowed. "I apologize, Ashworth. I encountered the Duchess and found myself detained by fascinating conversation." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. Shall we proceed to business?" He did not look at Elara again, but as she excused herself and climbed the stairs to her chambers, she could feel his gaze on her back like a physical weight. Something had shifted in the air between them. She did not know what it meant. But she knew, with a certainty that made her pulse quicken, that Alexander had finally noticed her. The weeks that followed were strange and strained. Lord Harrington's business with Alexander required several visits to Ashworth Hall, and on each occasion he sought out Elara's company. He was charming and intelligent and utterly undemanding. He did not want anything from her except conversation, and she found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that surprised her. Alexander watched it all from a distance. He began appearing in places she did not expect him: the library when she was practicing her Italian, the stables when she was preparing for her morning ride, the morning room where she worked on the accounts. He never spoke. He simply lingered at the edges, observing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. One evening, a month after Lord Harrington's first visit, Alexander appeared at the door of her private sitting room. It was the first time he had ever sought her out in her own space. "You have been spending a great deal of time with Harrington," he said without preamble. Elara looked up from her book. "He is an interesting conversationalist." "He is a known flirt." "Is he?" She kept her voice mild. "I had not noticed." Alexander's eyes darkened. "Do not be naive, Elara. A man like Harrington does not seek out a married woman's company for intellectual stimulation." The words landed like a slap. Elara closed her book slowly, her heart beating hard against her ribs. "And what does he seek, in your estimation?" "I think you know." She stood, and for the first time in their marriage she did not lower her gaze. "Let me understand you clearly, Alexander. For 3 years you have shown no interest in whom I speak to, where I go, or how I spend my days. You have treated me as a piece of furniture in your home. And now, because another man has shown me basic courtesy, you presume to lecture me on propriety." Alexander's expression flickered. "That is not." "Is it not?" She took a step toward him. "Tell me, what changed? Was it the moment you realized I had stopped following you? The moment you noticed my chair was empty at dinner? The moment you saw another man look at me as though I mattered?" He did not answer. His face was pale, his hands clenched at his sides. "I have loved you since I was 17 years old," Elara said, and her voice did not waver. "I have given you everything I had to give. I have been patient and quiet and invisible, hoping that one day you would see me, but you never did, and I have finally accepted that you never will." She drew a breath, and the words that followed were the most difficult she had ever spoken. "I am done waiting, Alexander. I will not leave this marriage, I cannot. But I will no longer offer you a heart you do not want. From this day forward I am your Duchess in name and duty, nothing more." The silence that followed was absolute. Alexander stared at her, and for the first time in 3 years she saw something break behind his eyes, something that looked almost like grief. "Elara," he said, and his voice was rough. "I—" But she did not let him finish. She walked past him, out of the sitting room, down the corridor, and into the darkness of the garden. She did not weep. She had no tears left. But she felt, for the first time in years, something that resembled peace. The days that followed were quiet. Alexander retreated to his study, and Elara retreated to her work. They moved through the house like two ships passing in fog, never colliding, never connecting. The servants noticed the change, of course. They whispered in corners and exchanged meaningful glances, but no one dared speak openly. Lord Harrington returned to Thornwood, his business with Alexander concluded. Before he left, he sought out Elara one final time. "I hope I have not caused you difficulty," he said gently. "That was never my intention." "You have not," she assured him. "You reminded me of something I had forgotten." "And what was that?" "That I am worth speaking to." Lord Harrington smiled, and there was genuine warmth in it. "If you ever find yourself in need of a friend, Your Grace, Thornwood's doors are open to you." He bowed, mounted his horse, and rode away. Elara watched him go, and she felt nothing but gratitude. He had given her a gift without knowing it, the gift of being seen. It had been enough to wake her from her long slumber. Autumn deepened into winter. Snow blanketed the estate, muffling the world in white silence. Elara continued her work, her studies, her visits to the tenants. She grew stronger, calmer, more certain of herself. And Alexander watched her. He watched her from windows and doorways. He watched her across the dinner table, where she now ate in comfortable silence rather than anxious chatter. He watched her ride out each morning, her figure disappearing into the frostbitten landscape, and something in his chest tightened each time she went. He did not understand what was happening to him. He had spent 3 years believing his marriage was a transaction, his wife a stranger. He had been kind to her in his own distant way. He had never raised his voice, never been cruel, never denied her anything material. He had thought that was enough. But now she was different. She did not look at him with hope anymore. She did not linger in doorways or arrange her schedule around his. She spoke to him with polite efficiency, the way a steward might speak to an employer. She was still here, but she was gone. And he missed her. The realization came to him on a bitter December night, as he sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy he did not drink. The fire had burned low, and the house was silent, and he found himself listening for sounds that were no longer there. Her footsteps in the corridor, her voice in the morning room, her laughter, which he had heard so rarely that he could not recall its exact sound. She had laughed with Harrington. He had heard it from his study, that bright, musical sound, and it had cut through him like a blade. Not because he was jealous. He told himself he was not jealous, but because he realized in that moment that she had never laughed like that with him. Because he had never given her reason to. He thought of their wedding day. She had looked at him with such hope, such trembling, desperate hope, and he had looked through her as though she were a painting on the wall. He had not been cruel, but he had been absent. For 3 years he had been absent from his own marriage. And now she had stopped waiting for him to return. Alexander set down the brandy. He rose from his chair and walked through the darkened house until he reached the door of her bedchamber. He stood there for a long moment, his hand raised to knock. But what would he say? What words could possibly bridge the distance he had created? He lowered his hand. He walked away. But he did not sleep that night. And every night that followed, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of her footsteps in the corridor. They never came. The turning point arrived with the new year, in the form of a letter. It was addressed to Elara, and it bore the seal of thornwood. Alexander saw it on the silver tray in the entrance hall, and something cold settled in his stomach. He did not open it. He was not that sort of man, but he carried it to her himself. She was in the morning room, working on the accounts as always. She looked up when he entered, and her expression was calm, polite, distant. "A letter for you," he said, holding it out. She took it, glanced at the seal, and opened it without hesitation. Her eyes moved across the words, and a small smile touched her lips. Alexander's chest tightened. "From Harrington." "Yes," she said, folding the letter. "He writes to inquire after my well-being. He also sends news of a book he thought I might enjoy." How thoughtful of him. The words came out sharper than he intended. Elara looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes, not anger, but something closer to curiosity. "Does it trouble you?" she asked quietly. "Should it?" "I do not know, should it?" They looked at each other across the desk, and the air between them was thick with unspoken things. Alexander opened his mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but the words would not come. Elara waited, and when he did not answer, she nodded slowly, as though confirming something to herself. "Good day, Alexander," she said, and returned to her work. He left the morning room feeling as though he had failed some crucial test. The sensation gnawed at him for days, an ache he could not locate, a wound he could not see. He began to notice things he had never noticed before. The way the servants brightened when Elara entered a room. The way the tenants spoke of her with genuine affection. The way she had transformed Ashworth Hall from a cold, efficient estate into something warmer, more human. She had done all of this while he was not looking. The guilt was immense. It pressed down on him like a physical weight, making it difficult to breathe. He had married a remarkable woman and he had treated her as an obligation. He had been so consumed by his own concerns, the estate, the politics, the endless demands of his position, that he had never once stopped to consider what she might need. And now, when he finally looked at her, she had stopped looking back. February brought a fever to the estate. It swept through the tenant village with brutal speed, striking down the young and the old alike. Elara did not hesitate. She packed baskets of medicine and food, summoned the estate's physician, and rode out into the snow to help. Alexander found out only when his steward mentioned it in passing. "The Duchess has been in the village since dawn, Your Grace. She is assisting with the sick." Something cold gripped Alexander's heart. "The fever is dangerous. Why was I not informed?" The steward looked startled. "I assumed you knew, Your Grace. The Duchess has been tending the tenants for months." Months? She had been doing this for months, and he had not known. He had not noticed. He had been so blind, so utterly consumed by his own world that he had missed everything. He ordered his horse saddled and rode to the village through the driving snow. When he arrived, he found her in a cramped cottage, kneeling beside a child's bed, her gown stained with medicine and her hair falling loose from its pins. She was bathing the child's forehead with a damp cloth, her voice soft and soothing. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment her expression was unguarded. Surprise, confusion, a flicker of something warmer. "Alexander, what are you doing here?" "I came to find you." He crossed the room, his heart pounding. "You should not be here alone. This fever is dangerous." "I am not alone," she said calmly. "The physician is next door and the tenants are helping each other. I am perfectly safe." "You are not safe. You are exhausted and exposed and doing my duty," she finished quietly. "As Duchess, as caretaker of these people, is that not why you married me, to manage your obligations?" The words struck him like a physical blow. He stared at her, and all the things he wanted to say crowded in his throat, choking him. "No," he said finally, his voice rough. "That is not why I married you." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned back to the child, adjusting the cloth with gentle fingers. "Then I do not know why you did," she said. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Alexander had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer, but it was one he had only just begun to understand. He had married her because it was convenient, because the debt needed settling, because he had not believed marriage required anything more than a contract. He had been wrong. He had been so terribly, catastrophically wrong. The fever lasted 3 weeks. Elara worked tirelessly and Alexander worked beside her. He did not know what else to do, so he followed her lead, carrying supplies, fetching water, sitting with the sick when she needed rest. The tenants were shocked to see their duke in such humble circumstances, but they accepted his presence with quiet gratitude. And in those 3 weeks, something changed between them. They did not speak of it. There was no grand confession, no emotional outpouring, but the silence between them became less strained. The distance began to shrink. Alexander found himself watching her not with guilt or confusion, but with something that felt terrifyingly like admiration. She was extraordinary. He had always known it intellectually. She was the Duchess of Ashworth after all, but he had never seen it. He had never allowed himself to see it. Now he could not look away. On the final day of the fever outbreak, as the last patient recovered and the village began to heal, Alexander found Elara sitting alone on a low stone wall at the edge of the village. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the snow. She looked tired but peaceful, her face turned toward the fatting warmth. He sat beside her without speaking. They remained there for a long time, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The cold nipped at their cheeks, and their breath misted in the air, but neither moved to leave. Finally, Elara spoke. "Thank you for your help these past weeks. The tenants were grateful." I did nothing, it was all you. She shook her head. You were present, that is not nothing. Alexander's throat tightened. Elara. She turned to look at him, and her eyes were soft in the dying light. Yes. I owe you an apology. She did not interrupt. She did not look away. She simply waited, patient as she had always been, while he gathered the words that had been building in his chest for months. I have been absent from this marriage since the day it began, he said. His voice low. I told myself it was because the marriage was a transaction, that affection was not required, that you would be content with comfort and status and the title of Duchess. He drew a shaking breath. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. And I did not realize it until I saw you pulling away, until I felt your absence like a cold wind, until I understood that you had stopped loving me. Elara's expression flickered, but she said nothing. I do not know if I can earn that love back, he continued. I do not know if I deserve the chance, but I want you to know that I see you now. I see everything you have done for this estate, for these people, for me, and I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry that it took me 3 years to open my eyes. The silence stretched between them. Then Elara reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was steady. She did not speak. She did not offer forgiveness or reassurance. She simply held his hand, and that small gesture contained more grace than Alexander had ever received in his life. I stopped loving you because it hurt too much, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But I never stopped hoping you would see me. I see you, he said, and his voice broke on the words. I see you, Elara, and I am terrified that I have seen you too late. She looked at him and something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall she had built around her heart, a possibility. It is not too late, she said, but it is not simple either. I cannot go back to who I was before. I cannot be the woman who waited in doorways for a glance that never came. I do not want that woman, Alexander said. I want the woman who manages the accounts and speaks Italian to the roses and rides into fever-stricken villages without hesitation. I want the woman who stopped needing me and became someone I need instead. Elara's eyes glistened. You do not know me well enough to need me. Then let me learn, he said. Let me try, that is all I ask. The sun had fully set now and the stars were emerging, cold and bright above them. Elara looked up at the sky, and Alexander watched her profile, the elegant line of her jaw, the curve of her lips. Very well, she said at last, you may try. It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of forever, but it was an opening, a door that had been closed for 3 years, now standing slightly ajar. Alexander squeezed her hand gently, and she did not pull away. They walked back to the estate together, through the snow and the silence, and for the first time in their marriage, they walked side by side. Spring came slowly to Ashworth. The snow melted into mud, and the mud hardened into green, and the gardens erupted with color. Elara continued her work, her studies, her writing, but now Alexander was often beside her. He joined her on her morning rides, learning the paths she had discovered alone. He sat with her in the library while she practiced her Italian, asking questions about the language with genuine curiosity. He began to learn the names of the tenants, the details of the accounts, the rhythms of the household she had managed alone for so long. It was awkward at first. They had spent 3 years as strangers, and intimacy did not come easily. There were silences that stretched too long, conversations that faltered, moments when the old distance threatened to return. But they persisted. One evening in late April, as they sat together in the garden watching the sunset, Elara spoke the words Alexander had been longing to hear. I am beginning to know you, she said. The real you, not the Duke, not the legend, just Alexander. His heart clenched, and what do you think of him? She considered the question carefully. I think he is kinder than he allows himself to be. I think he has been lonely for so long that he forgot what companionship felt like. I think he is trying, truly trying, to be someone worthy of love." "And am I," he asked, "worthy?" Elara turned to look at him, and her eyes held the warmth of the setting sun. "I think you always were. You simply did not believe it." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Her fingers were warm now, the spring air gentle around them. "I loved you too late," he said. "That will always be my greatest regret." "Then do not love me late," she replied. "Love me now, love me well. That is all any of us can do." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of reverence, of gratitude, of hope. She smiled, and in that smile Alexander saw the future stretching before them, imperfect, uncertain, but full of possibility. The Duke and Duchess of Ashworth walked back to their home as the stars emerged overhead. They walked together, hand in hand, no longer strangers, no longer distant. They had found each other at last. And this time, neither of them would let go. In the weeks that followed, the household noticed the change. The servants smiled more openly. The tenants spoke warmly of the Duke's newfound presence among them. The great halls of Ashworth, once cold and silent, began to fill with conversation and laughter. Alexander learned that Elara took sugar in her tea but not her coffee. She learned that he could not sleep without reading first. He discovered her talent for sketching. She discovered his secret fondness for poetry. They built a friendship from the ruins of their marriage, brick by careful brick. It was not the grand romance Elara had once dreamed of. It was something quieter, truer, more enduring. And one morning, as they sat together in the morning room, Alexander looked up from his correspondence and found her watching him with an expression he had not seen before. "What is it?" he asked. "I am happy," she said simply. "I did not think I would ever be happy here." He set down his pen, and now I am learning to hope again." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Elara, I cannot undo the past. I cannot give you back those 3 years, but I can give you every day I have left, if you will have them." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man she had loved since she was 17. Changed, humbled, earnest. "I will have them," she said. He kissed her then, softly, tenderly, a kiss that held 3 years of absence and a lifetime of promise. And when they parted, she was smiling. The story of the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth did not end with a grand ball or a dramatic declaration. It ended quietly in the small moments that make up a life. Morning rides through the countryside, shared books in the library, laughter over breakfast, hands held in the darkness. They were not perfect. They still argued, still misunderstood each other, still fell into old silences, but they always found their way back. Because love is not a single moment. It is 1,000 small choices, made again and again over years and decades. And they chose each other. Every single day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next amazing story.